Executive of Poet in the City, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for an event exploring the relationship between poetry and architecture. For those of you who don't know us, Poet in the City is an organisation dedicated to creating inspiring platforms for poetry and new audiences for the art form. And we do this through delivering a whole range of different events celebrating great classic and contemporary poetry, commissioning new work, and through our volunteering, education and participation schemes. Tonight is the second in a series of events which is part of our Platforms programme, and this is a programme which seeks to provide opportunities to talented young poets who are also editors and curators, and providing them with connections to our partners and to our audiences as a means of supporting their own initiatives and helping them to develop new networks. This programme includes Catherine Hamilton, who is the curator of tonight's event, and you're going to hear from shortly, and the poets Rachel Allen and Declan Ryan. Catherine is going to introduce the theme and speakers this evening, but just to say a few words about her. Catherine is a writer based in London who recently graduated from UCL with a BA in English Literature and is also a member of Store Associates. Catherine is the founder and director of Swimmers, which is a cross-arts event series with a particular focus on poetry, architecture and the city. And we were very keen to create this opportunity for Catherine at the RIBA this evening, given the nature of her work. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Catherine, who's going to introduce the evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. So it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to explore this subject publicly with the RIBA and Poet in the City, which are two great organisations, and also with the four fantastic speakers that we have here. The relationship between poetry and architecture is something I've been thinking about in my own work for quite a while, and also, well, since I joined STORE, which is an architectural association, in 2013, and started my own series of events, Swimmers. STORE is made up of 22 associates, most of whom are trained or practicing architects. And it was soon after I joined in 2013 that we were given an empty space in Bloomsbury. And this is where I began my events. So we had readings from emerging poets like Ollie Hazard and Declan Ryan. The associates of STORE were engaged with the series from the start. And during our time at the Bloomsbury space, they constructed a cinema and reading room, a gallery space, and a library. And so the relationship between the space itself and the readings and performances was always key. Each event had its own requirements, and so the space gradually took on a sort of versatile form and was in constant dialogue with the activities taking place within it. The Swimmers began with a focus on the city, specifically this city, London, in an attempt to explore the relationship between practice, perception, and the city space. And for me, the series grew out of some dissatisfaction with, as I saw it, a lack of an interdisciplinary approach to learning in the academy. Working with the architects and artists at STORE and finding unusual connections between their practice and my own more specifically literary interests gave me a great sense of freedom and led me to further question the often rigid separation of these disciplines. Of course, there is a danger inherent in too crudely bringing together seemingly disparate practices, but I do believe there is an urgent need to find ways in which to do this, both critically and creatively. It was in the Bloomsbury space that I wanted to really emphasize the importance of the physicality of listening to poetry, and further to this, thinking carefully about how our engagement with language can be influenced by the spaces we inhabit. Critical and cross-disciplinary dialogue within the arts is, I believe, of great importance, at a time when many of those in positions of power would have us separated, our resources and energies dissipated. And questions of our contemporary experience of space and of modern habitation and habit, indeed the distinction between the public and the private, are of huge importance in the current climate. And I hope that this event and the programme of which it is the start can begin to explore some of these questions in ways that can offer some answers, or at least new ways of questioning, thinking, creating, and perhaps even being. So I'm going to welcome the speakers now. Niall McLaughlin will be our first speaker. He's an award-winning architect who established his own practice in London in 1990. Niall McLaughlin architects make high-quality modern buildings with a special emphasis on materials and detail. Niall won Young British Architect of the Year in 1998. He was one of the BBC Rising Stars in 2011, and his work represented Britain in a recent US exhibition, Gritty Brits, at the Carnegie Mellon Museum. He's also a visiting professor of architecture at University College London. Catherine Kelleher's first book, One-Eyed Lee, was shortlisted for the Costa Poetry Award and longlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize for writers under 30. She is working towards a PhD which looks at the intersection between architecture and poetry, especially in Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy. Will Alsop is a prominent architect and artist who established All Design in 2011. He was awarded the Reba Sterling Prize for Peckham Library, London, and the first Reba World Award for the Sharp Centre of Design in Toronto. His architectural work encompasses all sectors, and his studio practice incorporates painting and product design. Matthew Gregory was born in Suffolk in 1984. His poems have appeared in magazines and anthologies since 2005, and he has collaborated with artists in Naples, Berlin, and Frankfurt on installations and film. He received an Eric Gregory Award in 2010 and a Hawthornden Fellowship in 2014. He is completing a PhD at Goldsmiths at the moment, in which he considers the influence of visual technology on contemporary poetry. So we'll hear from Niall first, if you'd like to come up.
I lost my job in 1990, and I was scrabbling around doing interviews with practices who I didn't really want to work for, and wondering, could I ever pluck up the courage to work for myself? And I found this wonderful piece of advice from Heaney's Station Island, where the young poet meets the ghost of James Joyce, who says, "You lose more of yourself than you redeem doing the decent thing. Keep it a tangent. When they make the circle wide, it's time to swim out and fill the element with signatures on your own frequency. Echo soundings, searches, probes, allurements, elver gleams in the dark of the whole sea." I think it's very difficult to speak about poetry, and I don't think I'm going to. Usually I talk about my work and describe the projects. But this time I thought what I would do is to take poems which I use to design projects. When I read poems, sometimes they conjure a situation so convincingly that I feel like I want to, in some way, make that situation. I want to bring the imagined situation in the poem into being. And so each of the fragments of poems I'm going to read here are related to projects which I designed. And my promise is that they were not selected to describe the project after it was designed, but were genuinely things that predated the project and to some extent brought the project into being in my imagination. The Carmelite Chapel in Kensington is a sacred space beside a walled garden. And in Christian theology, the walled garden is an image of nature, while the chapel is nature sublimated, turned into symbol. And I contrasted two sections from Yeats's poem, Sailing to Byzantium, one for the garden and one for the chapel. The first one, the profusion of life, the cycle of life. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, the birds in the trees, those dying generations of their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies, caught in that sensual music all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. And the last stanza, once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what's past, or passing, or to come. So everything in the chapel is gold, and I wanted a kind of retinal fizz when you saw the green of the garden at the window. Here's a tiny project I did back in the 1990s. Just on the right-hand side of the image, you can see my client's hut. She's a photographer, and it was made for her by her father. It's a garden shed with conventional bay windows pasted onto each side of it. And I thought it was the most proper piece of architecture I'd ever seen. I couldn't think of anything more upstanding and upright. So I made a drawing of my project, which is the pond which we designed on. And just on the right-hand side, you can see that I've called her hut Sean, and I've called my project Shem. And Shem and Sean, of course, are the two brothers who face each other across the water in Finnegan's Wake. One stands for order and propriety and everything in the world being where it should be, and the other stands for the dirty, messy, creative force. So here's Shem. Shem is as short for Seamus as Jem is jokey for Jacob. A few toughnecks are still gettable who pretend that aboriginally he was of respectable stemming. But every honest-to-goodness man in the land of the space of today knows that his back life will not stand being written about in black and white. Putting truth and untruth together, a shot may be made at what this hybrid actually was like to look at. Shem's bodily get-up, it seems, included an adze of a skull, an 8 of a lark's eye, a whole of a nose, 1 numb arm up a sleeve, 42 hairs off his uncrown, 18 to his mock lip, a trio of barbels from his megageg chin, the wrong shoulder higher than the right, all ears, an artificial tongue with a natural curl, not a foot to stand on, a handful of thumbs, a blind stomach, a deaf heart, a loose liver, 2/5 of 2 buttocks, 1 Gleatstein avoir du poidet, for him, a man-root of all evil, a salmon's calf's thick skin, eel's blood in his cold toes, a bladder tristended, so much so that young Master Shemmy, on his very first debauch, at the very dawn of prehistory, seeing himself such and such, when playing with thistle words in their garden nursery. We won a competition for a building in Deal in the south of England, and it was a cafe at the end of a pier which was half a mile out into the English Channel. And I had a kind of yin and yang sense of this too. I had Robert Lowell's Quaker Graveyard at Nantucket, which I haven't time to read, and the sense of the force and strangeness of the sea. But the one I want to read to you, which to me is a fantastic conjuring of the quality of this place, is At the Fish Houses, or part of At the Fish Houses, by Elizabeth Bishop. The air smells so strong of codfish, it makes one's nose run and one's eyes water. The 5 fish houses have steeply peaked roofs, and narrow, cleated gangplanks slant up to storerooms in the gables, for the wheelbarrows to be pushed up and down. All is silver, the heavy surface of the sea swelling slowly, as if considering spilling over, is opaque, but the silver of the benches, the lobster pots, the masts scattered among the wild, jagged rocks, is of an apparent translucence, like the small old buildings with an emerald moss growing onto their shoreward walls. The big fish tubs are completely lined with layers of beautiful herring scales, and the wheelbarrows are similarly plastered with creamy, iridescent coats of mail, with small iridescent flies crawling on them. Up on the little slope behind the houses, set in the sparse, bright sprinkle of glass, is an ancient wooden capstan, cracked with 2 long bleached handles and some melancholy stains like dried blood where the ironwork has rusted. And then to skip to the end of it, which I think is one of the most beautiful descriptions. The water seems suspended above the rounded grey and blue stones. I have seen it over and over, the same sea, the same slightly indifferently swinging above the stones, icily free above the stones and then the world. If you should dip your hands in, your wrist would ache immediately, your bones would begin to ache, and your hand would burn as if the water were a transmutation of fire that feeds on stones and burns with a dark grey flame. If you tasted it, it would first taste bitter, then briny, then surely your tongue would burn. It is like what we imagine knowledge to be, dark, salt, clear, moving, utterly free, drawn from the cold, hard mouth of the world, derived from the rocky breasts, forever flowing and drawn, and since our knowledge is historical, flowing and flown. I did a project for an amazing site, which was a flower farm in Northamptonshire. And I read these 2 poems by Sarah Maguire, which are about the artificial cultivation of plants in polytunnels and glasshouses. You can see the polytunnels just at the top of this image of the model. Year-round chrysanthemums. In mid-July, they think it's winter. All it takes is an hour's incandescence at midnight, and their day germinates. 24 hours makes 2. Year-round chrysanthemums, the long nights make you rich and fecund. Your bunched, curled faces, magenta and saffron, phototropic with desire, inexorably riding the light. And finally, a poem I want to read from a competition document which we produced for a chapel in Northamptonshire, in Oxfordshire. And I wanted to, when we did the competition interview, we read this poem out at the interview as embodying what we wanted the chapel to be like. The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayers inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails, and then as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. This man can't bear our life down here and will drown, the abbot said, unless we help him. So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the little man climbed back out of the marvelous as he had known it. What I love about that poem is the missing word is nave, which is the Christian word for the body of a chapel, and of course the word for a ship. So we made this drawing of the ship in the air with the community of the faithful looking up at it. And we made this building with its ship in the air. And finally, I'd like to just talk about a drawing that we made collectively when we were designing the building. And since we were looking at Heaney's collection of poems, the last one was from Lightnings. The complementary poem in that is Squarings. And for architects, drawing is the most important and intimate task. And this is actually a description of boys playing marbles. But it's very like what it felt like for us to make this drawing. You can see this photograph is taken from the ceiling of the room, and we've poured lime plaster onto the floor, and we're drawing the chapel on the floor. It took us a week, but here we're playing marbles, or maybe we're drawing, and I'll close with this. Squarings. In the game of marbles, squarings were those anglings, aimings, feints, and squints you were allowed before you'd shoot. All those hunkerings, tensings, pressures of the thumb, test-outs and pullbacks, re-envisagings, all the ways your arms kept hoping towards blind certainties that were going to prevail beyond the one-off moment of the pitch. A million accuracies passed between your muscles' outreach and that space marked by 3 round holes and a drawn line. You squinted out from a skylight of the world. Thank you.